next we will definitely be getting into a very great conversation on anti-Black racism and its impacts on Black students with Evelyn, our amazing speaker for today. Before we get into that, though, we do want to show a video that just gives some examples of students that are, of course, Black students that are actually in Canada that have, been through the Canadian school system, and they're just speaking on their experiences with anti-Black racism in the school system. So we'll get into a few of those examples from them. It's from a documentary, a really amazing documentary, and we can even share the link if you'd like to watch the full thing. It's about 30 minutes long. We'll just be watching a 2-minute clip together now. Thank you. And then we'll hear from Evelyn.
Entire schooling experience. Before coming to university, I had one Black teacher in grade 7. I'll never forget her. Still talk to her to this day. There were other Black teachers at schools I went to. We knew of them. We just were never fortunate enough to have them as teachers, especially because I did French immersion. So that was a little bit harder even to find Black teachers that were teaching French. So yeah, there was one, when my sister was in high school, my sister went to the same high school I did. She had a Black vice principal. And I remember I was like, yes, I'm gonna go to that high school. I'm gonna have a Black vice principal. And they moved her right before I got there. And I was very sad. So yeah, not many Black people in position of power.
What was your perception of Canada before you got here?
Just from what I've seen on TV, it just seems like the better alternative to the US, basically. So if you want to get that westernized North American experience, you would be more comfortable in Canada.
A new experience. I've never been outside of the environment that I've known as home. I've never been in an alien environment and appeared as other,
Other.
Yeah.
You wanna speak more on that?
So other meaning, speaking to the process of othering that a lot of Black and racialized people go through when they immigrate to a different country, specifically a Western country. You see, I spoke on this in one of my classes. It was this, rant I went on. I wasn't a nigger until I came to Canada, back home, I'm Saiyan, or around my brethren, I'm dogs, or if I'm with my family, I'm Sai dogs, or I'm just Sai. But in this country, I'm defined by my do-rag, by my joggers, by my Black hoodie, and by my skin tone. In this country, I am a nigger.
Okay, yeah. I was going to jump right into the presentation, but I actually want to ask a quick question before I do. Maybe folks can use the chat if you can. But how many people had Black teachers? How many people who went to school here in Canada had Black teachers? And if so, you could just raise your hand. There's about 20 of us in the room here. So you can either use your emoji there and kind of put up your hand, or you can go in the chat and say yes or no, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see. Okay, so I'm getting some no's. I saw 2 people put up their hand. I think it was Jada and Tiana I saw. Sophia saying yes. No, yes, no, yes. Yes, no. 1 and 1 student color grade, okay. Okay, a shop and automotive teacher, yes. Okay, these are more yeses than I normally get in when I do these sessions. So definitely there's something is shifting. For me, when I heard the young lady speak at the beginning, I just went back to my experience. I grew up in mainly racialized and predominantly Black communities in Toronto. So I lived in Rexdale. I went to high school in Rexdale. I went to elementary school, Jane and Jane and Lawrence area, and I never had a Black teacher. I went to York University, never had a Black professor until I got to graduate school. And for a lot of people my age, I'm not going to tell y'all what my age is, but for a lot of people my age, that is a very common experience. And I think that it's impactful for a lot of reasons that I'll get into as we move forward with the presentation. So I just want to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about, hopefully for the next about, I'm not sure how long, I'll see. Sometimes I go off on these rants when I get really into things, but I'll try to make sure that I leave some space for questions. But I wanted to start off with some key things that I think it's important for folks to know about anti-Black racism. These are not the typical things you hear about anti-Black racism. They're things that I think are really important that we often miss as a part of the conversation. So I'm going to start off there, and then I'm going to do a bit of I'm going to just define anti-Black racism. I'm also going to give you a definition that I really like, that I find helps people to enter the conversation a little bit more easier. I'm going to go into some historical examples of what anti-Black racism looks like in Canada, specifically. Going to give you some other examples, microaggression stereotypes, and then I'm going to tie everything together at the end with some examples of how that really impacts Black students within the school system. And so that is sort of the plan. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself or put up your hand. I don't want to move forward unless we're all like on the same page. And so if there's something that is like really burning that you just don't understand what I'm saying, please interrupt, because most likely somebody else has that same question. And so, yeah, let's get started. So next slide, please. So there's some key things to know about racism. What I find is that many people think that ignorance and hate is what led to racism and what leads to racism, racist ideas. And what I think is really important, that if we actually look at history, what actually leads to racial discrimination is people defending, is people wanting to defend their self-interest or protect their self-interest. And so it's really important that we actually have this conversation about where do racist ideas come from and why do they exist in the way that they exist within our society, and historically, why have they existed in that way? And so it's really important to actually differentiate, like, is racism about hate or is racism about protecting your own self-interest? Because by differentiating those two things, we get to a place where we realize that if people are invested in protecting their self-interest, that's actually a much more complicated thing to unpack and to unravel and to solve. And to say that racism is about hate, it makes it seem like it's an individualized problem, right? Like these people just don't like these other people. When racism is actually much deeper than that. It's not just about people not liking people. It's about people wanting to protect their self-interests, the interest of people that look like them, and therefore subscribing to racist ideas as a way to justify, right, that protection of your own self-interest. And this happens in different ways in our society. It even happens through a gendered way, right? Like if men want to protect their own self-interest, they create ideas about women that allow them to protect their own self-interest, right? So it's really about privilege and protecting those things. I like to really start off with this because I want us to really think about what is our own self-interest when it comes to this conversation around race. A lot of us really endeavor to be anti-racist, and we really think about what it means for us to be anti-racist, but we haven't asked ourselves, what is my interest in upholding these systems, or what is my interest, or how do I benefit from these systems as Black people, as racialized people, as non-Black people, non-racialized people, as white people? The system does benefit us in different ways. And so it's really important that when we start off this conversation to really think about what's my interest here? How does this system benefit me? And if I'm trying to move toward being anti-racist, I need to start at that place. And so racist ideas are just that. They're actually just ideas. They're ideas that people hold. And people hold them because they are interested, again, in just that protection of their own self-interest. I'll give you some really good examples that ties this together when we get into some historical examples of what's happened in Canada. We can go on to the next slide. Oh. Okay, so yeah, perfect, thank you. So defining anti-Black racism. So anti-Black racism is defined, this is the textbook definition: policies and practices that are embedded in Canadian institutions, reflect and reinforce beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, and stereotyping, and or discrimination that are directed at people of African descent and rooted in the unique history and experience of enslavement and colonization. I'm going to start us with that third point there. This question of rooted in the unique history and experience of enslavement and colonization. And so the reason why I start there and talking about anti-Black racism is because, you know, for a lot of people, anti-Black racism is a very new term. We grew up learning about racism, and in the past few years, anti-Black racism has become a bit more part of our conversation, part of our dialogues. And it was important for the Black community to speak about anti-Black racism as different from racism for this specific reason. And it's because of this connection to slavery and to colonization. I'm going to tell you what. So slavery was a system the transatlantic slavery was a system that impacted and particularly targeted Black people from Africa, particularly West Africa. But what that system did specifically was it created ideas about what it meant to be a Black person to justify their enslavement. Right. And so if the system which dehumanized Black people, used Black people as chattel, as just for the sake of their labor, so reduced you from your humanity to an object that then was, you know, you have to now work in these kinds of ways. There was a way in which the system needed to then dehumanize and create ideas that allowed for Black people specifically to be used as slaves. And so some of those ideas that came out during slavery, we still see those ideas show up today in terms of how Black people are seen by other people and the ways in which things impact Black people. And so I'm going to give you a really good example to kind of illustrate that. There was a study that happened, I think just a couple of years ago, that surveyed medical school students. And in that study, there was the question, was asked to there was an observation that med students were prescribing pain medication less to Black patients, right? So they would see a Black patient, the person would complain about being in some sort of pain, and they were prescribing pain medication less to Black patients than to non-Black patients. And so the researchers did ask a few more questions, like, you know, why are you racist? Do you feel like Black people don't feel pain, et cetera, et cetera? And the outcome of that conversation was that because Black people's skin is darker, there was a perception that it was also thicker, and therefore Black people felt less pain. That idea literally comes out of slavery. It's not something that doctor made up at that moment, that those doctors made up at that moment. Literally, the system of slavery said that Black people from West Africa have thicker skin because it's darker and therefore can feel less pain, right? So this is an idea that came out centuries ago, right? That defined the Black experience through slavery. And that same idea shows up today within our medical health system, right? That prescribes pain medication less to Black people. We know that death rates for Black women, for example, are higher during pregnancy and during childbirth and other engagements with the medical health system. So what's going on there? And so it's really important to have these conversations about these historical ideas that were used to justify slavery and how they continue to show up today. I'm going to give you a really good example that connects to our conversation today, this conversation around education and the ability to learn. One of the other justifications and ideas that came out during slavery and that was popularized during slavery was Black people's inability to learn. They can't think like us. They don't learn the way that we do. They don't have the ability to do these things. And so therefore, only their bodies are useful and should be used for labor. That was an idea that also came out during slavery. And we see this actually show up in our school system today, where we have a lot more Black students who are streamed into programs where, they're using their body more than they're using their minds, streamed into sports, right? Pushed into these kinds of sectors. And again, that's directly connected to these ideas that were popularized during slavery. And so for me, when we think about this definition of anti-Black racism, it's really important for us to think about the ideas that came out during slavery that continue to impact the Black experience today. And then the second part of that definition is around colonization. As most of us know, that the colonial system is one in which Europeans dominated. And not just did Europeans dominate, they also embedded a system which punished you the closer you were to being Black and rewarded you the further away from Blackness you were. Right? I'm going to say that again. The system of colonization punishes you the closer you are to Blackness and rewards you the further you are away from Blackness. And so what does that do for us? It means that it results in a kind of internalized hate, right? If the system that you're a part of says who you are, you're going to be punished for who you are. You're going to do your best to not be that person anymore. You're going to do your best to be something else, or you're going to do your best to try to be a part of that system, or to behave in the way that you think you're going to get the most amount of benefits. So that results in a kind of internalized racism, which we often talk about. But there's also that question of what does it do for people who are not Black, right? And again, this is not just white people, but everybody in between. All of us want to reap the rewards of what it means to not be Black. And so we all become kind of invested in these behaviors. So, I'm sure folks have heard of putting on your white voice, right? Acting white. Why do people put on a white voice? Because we know there's a particular kind of reward that comes along with putting on that white voice, right? So the benefits of that system, there's the benefits of looking and sounding and thinking about those things that we think make us more European, make us more white, as a way to get some more of those benefits. This also comes down to skin tone, right? The lighter skin you are, the more benefits you also receive as well. And so this, again, just reaffirms that idea that the further away from Blackness you are, the more rewards that you reap from the colonial system. And so these two unique experiences that Black people have had historically, enslavement and colonization, leads to the reason why we want to talk about anti-Black racism today, right? And why we need to define anti-Black racism as something different than racism that other folks experience. Then we connect it back to this idea around prejudices, stereotyping, and discrimination. And I will, is there a question that I should take? I just saw something pop up here.
There's a question, Ev, about if you have a link to the specific article you're making reference to. About pain and the study on pain.
Yeah, I can probably pull it up. I don't have it. I just know these things off the top of my head, but I can definitely just pull it up once I'm done my section. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the prejudices and stereotyping about Black people that come out of slavery as well. So the ideas that were popularized during slavery actually become those stereotypes that we buy into today, that we believe today, that are popularized today. Can you go on to the next slide? Oh, okay. I think I went a bit ahead of myself, but that's fine. So racist ideas are apparent in our histories, our laws, and our systems. And racism about a system that rewards and punishes based on your proximity to whiteness. And so when we're thinking about our school system, what does that mean for young people who are growing up in a school system that rewards you based off of your proximity to whiteness? What does that mean for our families that are engaging in a school system that rewards you based off of your proximity to whiteness? It means that the further away from whiteness you are, the less of those benefits and rewards you're going to receive, and you're going to receive more punishment. I'm going to give you guys some examples as well. Right now, I'm going to go into, can you go on to the next slide? So you can't really see this image here, but I wanted to give you an example of some policies that have existed within Canadian laws and Canadian history. So this is a signed order by Sir Wilfrid Laurier, which is banning Black people from entering Canada. And you can't read the text, but essentially it says that they're banning, Black people immigrating to Canada because the climate is not suitable to their race. And so this is an important example for me for a couple of reasons. So initially I had mentioned that racist ideas are about protecting your own self-interests, right? So if you know the history of Canada, there are Black people who fought on behalf of the Queen. They are known as the Loyalists. They predominantly live in, yes, I see an example there about Jewish people, and we could talk about all of the racist things that Canada has done historically. But thank you for mentioning that. But yeah, so there was a history of Black loyalists in Canada, and so here we have an order that says Black people are not suitable for the climate of Canada. However, prior to this, there was a time where Black people were actually being recruited to come to Canada to fight on behalf of the Crown. And so what does that tell us? Well, when Black labor was needed, then all of a sudden, okay, like Black people, there was the encouraging of Black people to come to Canada. Matter of fact, they were given land in Nova Scotia, known as Africville today. They were also offered freedom, right? So these are Black people who were enslaved in the U.S. who were offered freedom by the Crown to come to Canada, fight on behalf of the Crown, et cetera, et cetera. So there are all of these benefits and all of these ways to encourage Black people to come to Canada if they participated in these wars. And then just a few years later, you get this order signed that says, well, Black people are not suitable for the climate of Canada. So again, right, this is just to give you another example of how racist ideas really are come up and are solidified through our systems and our laws when they are in the interest of protecting, when they are protecting someone's self-interests, right? And in this situation, it's really about keeping Canada as white as possible. Can you go on to the next slide, please? And so here are a few other examples of anti-Black racism in Canada. So in 1629, the earliest documented occurrence of slavery in Canada, although the Color of Democracy tells us that the French introduced slavery into Canada as early as 1608, it was not abolished until 1834. This is really important because many people say that, I know now we know it to not be true, but slavery didn't exist in Canada. It wasn't like it was in the US, et cetera, et cetera. And here we have facts that tell us that slavery existed in Canada since the 1600s. In 1850, the Ontario government, so right in our province, introduces the Common Schools Act, which allowed for segregation of African Canadians. And so segregated schools, we had segregated schools in Ontario, and this policy was not eliminated until 1964. So that's not that long ago. Another really interesting thing, South Africa sends representatives to Canada to study our reserve system. And they actually base their reserve system in South Africa based off of our reserve system in terms of how we segregated Indigenous people. And I think that's an interesting connection, mainly because, it's important for us to also think about Indigenous, Black and Indigenous solidarity and what it looks like in terms of our histories and how they overlap and how they impact each other. I'm sure folks are familiar with Viola Desmond, who is a Black Canadian woman from Nova Scotia, who is now on the $10 bill, and she was arrested for sitting in a white section of a movie theater. And again, this is to give you some examples in terms of the ways in which segregation and anti-Black racism existed in Canada, in our laws, in our systems. It's not just the secret that was hidden that people had these racist beliefs, it was public and common knowledge. Next slide, please. So 1964 to 1969, we see the raising of Africville. So the same Black loyalists that I was mentioning earlier get pushed out of Africville because the government wants that land. In 1968, a 3-year-old Black girl is denied burial from a whites-only cemetery. I'm going to skip a few. In 1992, we have the Yonge Street riots, where we have people protesting police brutality against Black people. And actually, out of the 1992 Yonge Street riots is where we get the what is it called? That independent task force that reviews any killings that involve police. Somebody might somebody should remember the name and put it in the chat if you remember. I forgot. And then today in 2015 in Toronto, Black males are 3 times more likely to be stopped and asked for identification by police. And also Black people are 20 times more likely to be killed by police in Toronto. Another really good example in terms of some of these.
She was looking for people to do presentations. Yeah. And
sorry, Michael, do you mind muting? You're not on mute. Thank you. And a really interesting case, very sad, heartbreaking case that happened just a few years ago, where there was the little Black girl who was throwing a little bit of a temper tantrum and was handcuffed and put in the back of a police cruiser. That was in Toronto. And really recently, the investigation revealed that it was due to racial bias that she was treated the way that she was. And so these are all of some of the examples that we can think of. I'm sure there's a lot more, but these are just some I wanted to include in this presentation. I can go to the next slide. So here we just have some examples, some images. In the middle there is the Common Schools Act. So that again speaks to the act that allowed for segregation to happen. And you see that it's in Toronto. This on the right, there's an advertisement to be sold. A Black woman named Peggy, aged about 40 years, and a Black boy, her son, named Jupiter, aged 15 years. Both of them property of the subscriber. The woman is a tolerable cook and washerwoman and perfectly understands making soap and candles. The boy is tall and strong for his age and has been employed in country bushels, but brought up principally as a house servant. They're each of them servants for life. The price of the woman is $150, for the boy $200, payable 3 years with interest from the day of sale, and to be properly secured in bond, but 1/4 less will be taken if money is ready. This is signed by Peter Russell. This is in York, February 10th, 1806. What's really important about this is not just that it's evidence that slavery did exist in Canada, but it's actually evidence that it was popularized, right? This is an advertisement that was in a newspaper. This wasn't a secret letter that Peter was passing to his closest friends. This was in the paper. And, you know, he proudly signs his name, Peter Russell. And so again, I just want to reaffirm that slavery did exist in Canada. It was common, and why that's important for us to really understand is it connects back to what I was saying about the ideas that were popularized about Black people during slavery. Right? If these ideas that were popularized about Black people during slavery dehumanize Black people, popularized all of these, justified the reasons to use Black people as slaves, and slavery existed here in Canada, it means those ideas that existed about Black people exist here in Canada as well, right? And not only do they exist here in Canada as well, they exist locally in Toronto. All of these examples are from Toronto specifically to get that point across, right? If we know that slavery did exist here for over 200 years, those ideas circulated for over 200 years. And what's also more important is the fact that we've actually erased this history. So because we've erased this history, we can't actually locate the roots of where do these ideas come from? Why are Black people, for example, more likely to be in some of the positions that they are in, overrepresented in, you know, poverty, overrepresented in dropout rates, et cetera, et cetera? We come to understand those things as just the fault of Black people because this history is completely erased, right? So with this context, with this history, we can have a better understanding of what's going on today. Without this history, then we start to blame individuals and we say, well, it's because the Black community just cannot get it together, right? Without linking it to these systemic, historic experiences that continue to show up today in terms of the outcomes that exist for Black people. Can go on to the next slide. And so why do we talk about anti-Black racism specifically? So in Toronto, Black people make up 8.5% of the population, which is very small. Even though Toronto has one of the highest populations of Black people, we actually make up 8.5% of the population. Yet 85% of racist hate crimes in Toronto are against Black people. 13% of Black Torontonians are unemployed. This number is probably higher now given COVID and the impact of COVID on Black community, and at the time, this is 2 times the provincial unemployment rate. 27% of all carding incidences were focused on Black Torontonians, which is 3 times the representation of the overall population. 48% of Black children live in low-income households compared to 9% of non-racialized children. 42% of children in the care of children's aid are Black, which is 5 times the overall Black population in Toronto. And 48% of those expelled from school are Black, despite being only 12% of the Toronto Public School Board population. So just think about that number. Black students make up 12% of the school board population. This might be a little bit dated because these statistics are from, I think, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But make up 12% of the population, yet make up 48% of those who are expelled. That is crazy, right? This is what, so when we use the language overrepresentation, this is what we're talking about, right? You make up a small number of the population, but you end up being overrepresented in the overall category. Because, you know, math, for those of us who are good at math, not me, but for those of you who are good at math, you should be representative to, if Black people make up 12% of the school board population, suspension and expellation, is that a word? Expelling, sure, rates should be around 12%, 15%, maybe 20%, but expulsion, thank you. But 48%, right? That's a really huge gap in terms of that overrepresentation. And so we really need to take these numbers seriously because when there's an overrepresentation in this kind of way, it tells us there's something wrong with the system, right? We cannot blame ourselves. We cannot blame individuals. We have to look at the system and think, how are these numbers this way? There's clearly a failure somewhere in the system. Go to the next slide. So I'm going to move on to talk about stereotypes. I want us to really understand that stereotypes are not just stereotypes. They reflect and reinforce beliefs, attitudes, prejudices, and discrimination that are directed at people of African descent. Stereotypes about Black people come directly out of slavery and post-slavery conditions. I usually do a bit of an exercise. Let me check time. Okay, I won't do it now. But I want folks to think about the stereotypes you know about Black people. Just take like a second to just think about what are some of the first stereotypes that pop into your mind, and if you're comfortable, just share a word in the chat in terms of a stereotype that comes to your mind. And I'm not saying you necessarily believe in this stereotype, but just a stereotype that you've heard or that came into your head when I started talking about stereotypes. So single parent homes, angry Black woman, lazy, ghetto. Poor, stupid. Hood rat, so yes, ghetto, criminals, athletes, good entertainers, welfare queens. Yeah, likes flashy things, uneducated. Okay, we can resilient. Resilient is actually an interesting one. Loud, lazy, very tough, aggressive. So now I want you to think about some of these stereotypes that you've heard and think about what would have been the use of these ideas during slavery. What would have been the use of describing and projecting these stereotypes on Black people during slavery? Even a stereotype that a lot of people like to say is a positive stereotype, good at sports. What would have been the utility of that kind of stereotype during slavery? Somebody want to answer? I'm going into professor mode. I probably should. A strong worker, a good worker, right? Somebody that's really good at using their body. Yes, you can now sell them for more money. You saw the ad that I showed you, right? How did it describe the son that they were selling? He was tall and strong for his age, right? And he cost more than the mom. The mom was what, $150, and he was being sold for $200, right? So again, even a stereotype, because sometimes I do this exercise and people are like, well, yeah, there's good stereotypes too. And I'm like, there's no such thing as a good stereotype. For these reasons, right? Because the stereotypes that exist had a particular utility during slavery. If we want to go to the single mother stereotype, right? Black women don't care about their children. Therefore, it makes it easier to take children away from Black families and to sell them to other people and to use them for labor. And today that shows up within our care system. But also it shows up within our school system, where there's this assumption that black parents don't care about their children's education. They don't care to be involved in their children's education. And as such, we can just do as we please to the Black children in our class with no consequences. We won't face any consequences because these people just don't care about their children and don't care about their children's education, right? Yeah, so the Jezebel stereotype to justify sexual assault of Black women. Yep. So I really want us to, and sorry, I know I'm speeding through things. Usually this is like a much longer workshop, but we wanted to tie this in with the advocacy and whatnot. So I'm just kind of going really quickly through things. Oh, the school to prison pipeline. We can't even get into that conversation today, Michael, but thank you for raising that, because it's also really, you know what, actually I will get into it. You know why I'm going to get into it? Because I talked about the expulsion rates, right? And we're thinking about what happens when you push Black kids out of school. And so if Black kids make up 12% of the population, and we have this overrepresentation where 48% of expulsions are students who are Black, what are these children doing when they're pushed out of schools? Where do they go? What options exist for them? So then we get the school to prison pipeline. And the school to prison pipeline starts much earlier than, it was an example I was going to share in a few slides, but it starts much earlier than even high school. This starts from when children, the adultification of Black children, which I'm going to speak about in a few slides as well. You know what, I won't get ahead of myself. Let me take this question really quickly before we move on to the next slide. So do you think that the myth of parents not caring about their children's education is area specific? Do you mean areas in like the part of the city that you live in? Okay, I grew up in York region. Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to say a bit more. I don't actually think it's area specific, to be honest with you. I think that it's because the way that anti-Black racism exists everywhere. I know families who specifically move out of areas that have high populations of Black people because they think it's going to change their experience of anti-Blackness, and it doesn't change that experience of anti-Blackness, right? Like I know parents, friends of mine who have children who are in Hyde Park, for example, and they make the intention to be in these areas where they know that there's, there's more white people, let's be honest, because they think that being in those areas, being associated with those spaces means that they are going to have less of an experience of anti-Blackness. And in their experience, it has not. So I'm not sure if, like maybe for you, like you witnessed your friends' parents caring. And I would say that most parents care about their children's education, right? Like
Hi, Evelyn.
Yes.
Hi, sorry, just really quickly. So I went to Vaughan, Thornhill. And it was and this was in the early 90s, it was a pretty mixed bag of different religions and races. In fact, I think like Caucasian kids were the minority when the school first opened. It was at Dufferin and Steeles. And everybody graduated. And I keep in touch with a lot of the people that I went to school with, and they all became professionals and did well for themselves. And that's why I was wondering, is it area related or area specific? Because maybe in York, I don't know, I can only speak for York region, but I found that the parents are more involved, and were more strict and probably moved to that area just so their kids could have a better chance, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, the thing that I think might be interesting there is a bit of a class analysis. And so when folks have access to a different class privilege, right? So if you're in areas like Thornhill, like we can assume that you have a bit more class privilege. That's why you're able to be in those spaces. And so that maybe kind of empowers you to be able to be involved in your child's education in a way that kids who are, so Black parents and sorry, I'm trying to read, let me minimize the chat because I'm trying to read it and talk at the same time. It's not going well. But I think that there's a bit of a class privilege that also comes along with living in areas, because again, if one, people do respect people a bit differently who are a part of a different class, right? If you are more middle class and you're in these spaces, I think that you do get a different kind of treatment. I've had parents say, when they go to parent-teacher interview, for example, Black parents feel like they have to wear their best clothes. They bring they'll bring like an expensive looking purse because they feel like that's going to get them respect in a different kind of way. And so I think maybe what might have happened through your experience might be a thing around class privilege, but I can't speak on it for sure. But what I do know, and I think Kemi raised it in the chat, is if you speak to Black parents who are in areas even that are different areas in the city, they will probably tell you that they experience racism and anti-Black racism. Let me just take some of these points in the chat before I move on. Yeah, so Kemi says, and then the propagation of the notion that as Black students work twice as hard as others. Yeah, and Abigail mentioned funding and resources differ amongst school regions that affect graduation rates and school success. And that's also very true. I think we can talk about, Michael, we'll talk about the work twice as hard as others in the next, when we start talking specifically about some of the school specific examples. Thanks for everyone participating in the chat. Can we move on to the next slide? So here I've just listed, I do these workshops a lot, and doesn't matter where I go, everybody always says the same stereotypes about Black people. And the reason why that's really important to point out is because we all know these stereotypes. A lot of times we can't even locate where did we learn these things about Black people? Where did they come from? Why do we all know these things about Black people? And even if we don't believe in them, they are operating somewhere in our subconscious that impacts how we treat people, because we all know these. We all know these stereotypes. I've never done one of these sessions where somebody didn't name these stereotypes that are listed. And then I asked the question, where did you learn these stereotypes? Right? Where did you learn these things about Black people? And so whether it's from media or it's from, older generations, these stereotypes exist. And the other thing I really want to point out about stereotypes and why they are particularly harmful for Black populations is because a lot of times this is the only thing most people know about Black people, right? So if you didn't grow up with or around Black people or people that didn't look like you. Like I said, in Toronto, Black people make up 8.5% of the population. So those of us who live in communities that are diverse and racialized, we meet other people. But there's a lot of people in this city, Toronto, which is one of the most diverse cities in the world, who have probably never had a Black teacher, had a Black friend, right? Had any of these kind of intimate experiences with Black people. So what that means is what these people, the information they're getting is only the information based off of stereotypes. So let me ask you all a really quick question. So what stereotypes, actually, you know what, just to save us some time, one of the major stereotypes one of the major things that we know, for example, let's say about white people, is that in movies, in TV, they're usually the serial killer is a white man, right? Usually we can all agree on that. Usually the serial killer is a white guy, but most of us don't look at all white men and think that they are all serial killers. Why is that? Because we have access to so much other information that gives us so many other representations of what it means to be a white man, right? Not only do we see so many different representations of them on TV, we see different representations of them in our actual lives, right? They are our teachers, our politicians, our doctors, our bankers, our lawyers. We have so many different representations of them. So that one stereotype or that one thing that we see on TV all the time, which is the serial killer is a white man, it doesn't become the end all be all of what it means to be a white man. Right, I grew up at a time where The Simpsons was very popular, Family Guy, Married with Children, I think it was called. And what did all of those shows do? They showed incompetent white men as fathers. But most of us don't think all white men are incompetent as fathers. But we watch a few shows about Black families, and we come to the conclusion that all Black women are welfare queens or are single mothers who have all of these children with all of, and even if, right, that's the case, even if that's the case, like, because that does exist, but then we take that and that defines all Black women. It defines everybody. It defines all of Blackness. And the reason why that happens is because we don't actually have access to other things that challenge that one stereotype. And so the next thing I'm going to be talking about is bias and confirmation bias in terms of how our brains are wired. I'm going to go on to the next slide. I'm sorry, I just want to make sure people are following me. If you guys are following me, give me like a quick kind of like thumbs up, because I'm going through things a little bit quickly. And I really want folks, okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Can you go on to the next slide, please? And I always tell people, sorry, this is not me saying like, go out and find like a Black friend or like go find some Black person to teach you about Blackness or anything like that. What I'm really trying to point people to is what happens when all you're getting, when the only information you're getting about Black people is stereotypes, right? What that means is, you know, even if you don't want to believe in these stereotypes, you end up believing in them. They end up impacting you somehow. Can you move on to the next slide? I'm going to skip over this one. So I just want folks to focus on the last one here, which is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is seeking information to confirm our beliefs. If you go on to the next slide, I'm going to give a bit more details. So confirmation bias essentially is the way that our brains are wired. Our brains are wired to be very selective about information. It's just part of evolution, right? So usually with confirmation bias, your brain, things that you already believe in, your brain kind of seeks out that information and gives it more weight than anything else that exists. So even when there's things that are counter to that belief, your brain still seeks information and gives it more weight and validity than other things. And so the reason why I like to talk about confirmation bias and race is because I want us to really think about if we're being bombarded with these stereotypes that exist about Black people, those ideas exist in our brain. Right? These ideas then come out of a system of slavery that dehumanized Black people. And so now we have these stereotypes that come out of that system, and then our brains are seeking information that validates that information that we know. And not only is our brain doing that, our brain is giving more weight to this information. What does that mean for us? It means when you see that image of, you know, that Black person on CP24 being flashed at you all the time, that Black men are dangerous and et cetera, and then you see that Black guy walking on the street, you know, to the video that we saw earlier, or you see that Black student and he's in his hoodie, your brain automatically tells you that that person is dangerous. And then you give more weight to that, even though like that could just be a student wearing a hoodie, right? Similar to this question of, like I said about the serial killer question, you know, we don't look right away, seek out information that validates that white men are serial killers, but our brains automatically seek out this information that Black youth are up to no good, are troublemakers, are in gangs, are et cetera, right? And so it's really important for us to really challenge, to think about that confirmation bias and make that connection, right? What's happening in our brains that tells us, that validates everything that we're thinking, and what is the other information that challenges actually that one thing? Can you go on to the next slide? I think, sorry, I had asked, we can move on from this one as well. Sorry, I just want to get through. I wanted to talk a little bit about microaggressions. I will do this a little bit quickly as well, because I think it's really important for us to think about microaggressions in the classroom, in the school system, and again, really thinking about the ways in which microaggressions, here it says, you know, the everyday nonverbal slights, insults, intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group. I think that it's really important for us to think about how microaggressions make students very uncomfortable in classroom and push them out of classroom, out of the space, and push students, you know, and make it so people cannot learn, right? Because the space is just not safe and it's not comfortable. And for a lot of us growing up, we don't have access to language that allows us to describe what's happening with us, right? And so the days that sometimes, you know, you don't want to go to school because your teacher mispronounced your name and now everybody's making fun of you, or the teacher said something about your hair and now everybody's making fun of you. And you don't have the language as a child to say, like, these are microaggressions and this is how it's causing some sort of trauma that makes me feel uncomfortable at school. Now you don't want to go to school. Your parent doesn't understand why, or your caregiver doesn't understand why. They're pushing you to go to school. You don't want to go, but you don't have the language to talk about these things. So it's really important that we're able to kind of name and think about, you know, what is the experience in the classroom that students are having, why they might not be engaging, why they might not want to go to school, what's happening there. And for a lot of times these things can come across as jokes. I'm Ghanaian, and you know, my family immigrated here from Ghana, so I was like really young when we came. My mom used to do our hair in this traditional Ghanaian style. I loved it. Like I loved when she did my hair that way. The first day she sent me to school, the teacher brought me to the front of the class, okay? So this woman brought me to the front of the class, was touching my hair, just made me a complete spectacle, right? So guess what I did as soon as I got home? I took that hairstyle out. I was like, no, never again. Am I ever, like, I refused to let my mom do my hair that way. And so something that was, you know, interesting to this teacher, because she's like, oh, like, this is such interesting hair that I've never seen before, made me feel very, very, very uncomfortable as a child. I didn't want to go to school. When my mom would do my hair like that, I would make up any excuse to not go to school. And I didn't have the language to tell my mom that's what was going on. Right. And so it's really important for us to think about some of these pieces as well, as we think about what does it look like for us to advocate for children in the classroom? What does it look like for us to have some of these conversations? And I think I'm getting a little bit of a signal that I'm running out of time. Can you go on to the next? Okay, this is sort of like the last slide that I wanted to talk about. And I'm going to give you a few different examples. Just a few different examples in terms of how these different points manifest. So naming anti-Black racism schools, the impact of stereotype and microaggressions, which I was just speaking to. But I think the other really important thing when I have these conversations, especially with parents, I think it's really important to arm yourself with this language around what anti-Black racism is and how it impacts your child. You know, I've had a conversation with a teacher. There was a child who I think was like 8, and he was already labeled like a troublemaker. And so what happened was, the September he was going into the next grade, he had a new teacher, everything. And already the teacher was like, oh, I've heard about you, right? And so obviously another teacher, his teacher from previous year, gave that teacher the impression that this child is a troublemaker, et cetera, et cetera. And from then, he had this label that would follow him throughout his whole educational career. And so it was important for that parent to make the point to the teacher about what labels do to Black children, right? Because I think sometimes teachers don't actually realize the impact of what it is that they are doing. Right? Oh, I'm just having this conversation with my colleague. Oh, watch out for that one. He's a troublemaker. It's just an innocent conversation. Not realizing that this label is now going to follow this child throughout his whole educational career. And then I think it was Michael maybe who brought up the school to prison pipeline. And this is where it starts. When we start putting labels on children, particularly Black children who suffer from also the adultification of Black children, which is literally a process where people see Black children as older than they actually are. And, you know, you could just do a quick Google of the word and it will give you some more information. But people see Black children. So if a child is 5, you see the child as an 8-year-old. And therefore, a couple of things happens as a result of that. You expect them to behave as an 8-year-old rather than as a 5-year-old. You will punish them as an 8-year-old rather than as a 5-year-old. You have different expectations for this child. You're less likely to be more understanding if the child is, for example, acting up or misbehaving. Also, you see them as more dangerous. right? So as Black children get older, you know, 13, 14 start to develop just like other children, do you see them as more of a threat? And so you're going to also punish them in a different way. If you see them as more of a threat, you see them as scary. And so the adultification of Black children is also an impact of impacts Black students. Impact of systemic anti-Black racism, and I put here, does your accent matter? Because I have numerous examples of students who come from Caribbean countries where the first language they speak is English, but they come here, even African countries, you know, where we've experienced colonization, which means most of us, our first language is English. They come to Canada and they get put into ESL. And when parents try to push back and advocate for their children when this happens, they're seen as being troublemakers. They're not seen as, you know, I've actually had CAS workers tell me that teachers will call CAS to report parents who are not cooperating with putting their children in ESL or putting them on the specialized, what do they call it now? When I was in elementary school, it was special ed, but I know they don't call it that now. But yeah, I've had CAS workers say that teachers do call because they feel like the parent is making the wrong decision for the child. And this mainly happens with Black and racialized children when they're being put into, you know, alternative forms of education. The fear of Black parents. Again, this is something IEP. Thank you, Marvin. The fear of Black parents is also something that I hear about a lot, where teachers are afraid to even pick up the phone and call somebody's parent to say, you know what, like your kid didn't come to school today with like a lunch. So rather than talk to the parent, they just call CAS. So when we see the overrepresentation of Black families in CS, a lot of that comes from teachers who are afraid of Black parents and don't want to have conversations with them because the assumption is that they're going to be difficult and, you know, the angry Black woman stereotype, et cetera, et cetera. And so to intervene, they either call CAS or they're using all of these other methods rather than just having conversations with parents. And then we have the impact of the lack of cultural understanding and the inability to see the snowball effect of this lack of cultural understanding. Teachers often feel like the decisions they're making are isolated. They are in a vacuum, but they are not in a vacuum. They're actually connected to the system of anti-Black racism that exists, right? And so this one decision that you make, okay, I'm just gonna tell my colleague that this child was causing trouble, not seeing that that's connected to the school to prison pipeline, right? And that label following that child throughout their whole educational career. And what I have found I have found to be very useful is actually naming that for teachers. I've said to teachers, you know what? This is the outcome for Black students in TDSB. What you've just done is contributing to that outcome, and here's why. And making that connection for them, because most people think that their actions exist in this vacuum and they don't see that what they're doing has the power to actually put this child on a trajectory that pushes them out of the school system. And it's really important for us to sort of like bring that all back together.